All right, hello and welcome back. Today we're going to begin our second unit on westward expansion, and this is going to be our first lesson, which I entitled Transformation of Continents. So the continent that we're going to be discussing in this unit, or at least in this lesson, is the continent of North America. So let's first define what North America is. So North America today is the body of land that includes modern day Mexico, modern day the United States, and modern day Canada. So those three countries combined are considered to be North America. But of course, you didn't have Mexico, the United States, and Canada, or at least as we know them today, existing in the 1800s. Canada was simply a colony of Great Britain and did not have its independence. Spain had taken over Mexico and labeled it the Viceroyalty of New Spain. And then the only real country that you have, independent country at this point, is the United States of America. But it's important to note that the United States hasn't been around for very long. In 1800, the U.S. has only existed for 24 years. This 25 years earlier was still a colony of Great Britain. But of course, in 1776, the United States had declared, well, I should say the 13 colonies had declared their independence from Great Britain and effectively formed a new nation. So in 1800, you have multiple groups that are laying claim over this territory in North America. You have the United States of America, but you also have France is claiming this large swath of land in the center of the country, what is known as the Great Plains of the United States, and this was what was considered Louisiana territory. You have the Canadian colony of Great Britain, and then as I mentioned, you have New Spain down in the south. You also do have way up north, which is still North America, although it's not what we consider to be in the United States right at this point. You do have Russia and Alaska. So Russia, because we all know that the globe is round and not flat, for all you flat earthers out there. You have Russia actually is right over in this area. So Russia is not too far from Alaska. In fact, it was old vice presidential candidate Sarah Palin had once made the comment that she could see Russia from her house. She was previously a governor of Alaska, and that just goes to illustrate just how close Alaska is to Russia. So you have European countries have a hand in North America. You have the United States. This brand new country has a hand and is laying claim over territory in North America. But don't forget about the hundreds of Native American tribes that are currently controlling territory in all throughout what we consider to be the United States. So as the country ends up growing in 1830, the western boundaries of the United States will begin to push west as we incorporate the Louisiana territory into the United States. We'll talk about that. We'll get there. And then in 1853, you have the United States reaches from coast to coast, from the Atlantic Ocean all the way over to the Pacific Ocean. Now, as this unit progresses, we'll talk about each of these annexations, each of these territorial incorporations a little more closely, but right now I just want to illustrate that in a period of 53 years we went from this tiny country to a country that spans from coast to coast. So let's jump into the content. So between the Atlantic and the Pacific, in 1800, as I mentioned, the United States border only reached the Mississippi River. So you could tell where the Mississippi River is because this is the border right here. And you can see the western border of the current state of Illinois is the Mississippi River. So you can see that protrusion right there. Over the next 50 years, the United States is going to expand across the continents and push natives off of their lands and force them onto reservations. Indian groups had declined from this position of power on the continent to thus a position of dependency. When they're pushed onto these Native American reservations, they become to be dependent upon the United States for aid. So, how does perspective affect the story of the U.S. westward expansion? So, one of the questions on the study guide, I want to say was question one, was this question about that had to do with the term westward expansion. So, the term westward expansion carries with it some bias. The westward expansion was westward expansion for white settlers, but it's important to note that there were multiple perspectives that contribute to this story. We already mentioned that Europeans had laid claim over territory in North America. Native Americans obviously lived on the land and therefore didn't just lay claim over territory, they effectively controlled territory in North America. So even though this unit is called westward expansion, it is important to note that this was a period of decline and loss for Native Americans, that this is not a time period that is viewed upon fondly by the Native American people. So the term itself, westward expansion, can be very misleading because the region is considered El Norte to the Spanish and the East to Russians. And as I mentioned, that you had natives who lived on the land, so this term of westward expansion really meant nothing to them because this wasn't the West, this was home to them. So once again, to revisit this map, when we're talking westward expansion, at least initially, westward expansion was the lands to the west of the Mississippi River. So you're really talking about this Great Plains territory. Well, to the Spanish, this was north. This was El Norte to the Spanish. And to the Russians, this was considered the east because remember, the Earth is a globe, so this wouldn't be just south. This would be really southeast to the Russian people. So a couple more things that I want to point out as we jump into this unit is that when we use the term Native Americans, that is a gross generalization of the different varied experiences that a multitude of tribes had experienced at this time. So their experiences with settlers, each one of these tribes, their experiences with settlers had varied. So there are some themes that were consistent, though. Some of the themes that tended to be consistent among interactions between natives and settlers was cultural misunderstandings had persisted. Cultural misunderstandings, for example, how land would be viewed. You had native people tended to take on this belief that the land did not belong to anybody, that the land was everyone's to use, and that the land was used for cultural, traditional, religious purposes. But the white settlers of this new country, the United States of America, believed in individual property ownership. This idea that you could own a plot of land that would be yours and yours exclusively to use. So that represents a cultural misunderstanding between natives and settlers. Another common theme is mistrust between individuals from different societies. The natives did not tend to trust settlers, and settlers did not trust the natives in most cases. Another consistent theme was that there was cooperation and exchange that had taken place between native groups and settlers, but it is important to note that the main theme was violence and conquest. When we're discussing this concept of westward expansion, we're talking generally about violent expansion and conquest of native lands. So, when did the history of the West actually begin? Well, in 1803, you had President Thomas Jefferson had organized an expedition to explore the western reaches of North America. And this was an expedition that was led by Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, otherwise known as Lewis and Clark. We'll talk about them a little bit towards the end of this lecture. Many traditional accounts, so many historians, begin their history of the West with the expedition of Lewis and Clark. However, it is important to note that these lands are actually very, very old and have been populated by diverse communities and cultures over thousands of years. That Lewis and Clark may have been the first American settlers to explore the lands to the west of the Mississippi River, but there were already people living there. Take Cahokia. So Cahokia, right now we're near Chicago. Cahokia is a town in southwest Illinois, right along the Mississippi River. And between the time period of 1050 and 1350, you had a flourishing Native American culture that had existed in this area and built these gigantic mounds. There was over 120 of these gigantic mounds that can be still to this day be seen if you were to travel down to Cahokia. These mounds were very, very complex and to make, and demonstrates the sophistication of the civilizations that had lived there during this time. So, how did European horses, guns, and diseases change the West? So, even prior to American settlers moving west, you had interactions between natives and the Spanish, natives and the French, natives and the British. So, European horses, guns, and diseases. Let's start first with horses. Well, I'm sorry, even before we get to horses, let's first talk about the difference between Eastern natives and Western natives. So Western natives had less contact with Europeans than Eastern natives. Eastern natives had contact with British settlers once you had these missions, once the Puritans had traveled across the Atlantic Ocean to settle in Jamestown, Virginia, and other British colonies. You had Eastern natives had interactions with British settlers right away, but Western natives in what we consider to be Central America here, Central United States, and the Western United States did not have as many interactions with Europeans as their Eastern counterparts. French fur traders in the north and Spanish missionaries in the south had interactions with natives, but you didn't have any permanent settlements that were created at this time. Rather, French fur traders in the north were more interested in trade for profit. You had Spanish missionaries coming north from the south, what we today consider to be Mexico, were interested in converting the natives to Christianity, Catholicism. So they desired resources and influence amongst local Indian groups. However, neither the French nor the Spanish were really all that interested in permanent settlements of native lands. So as the natives and Europeans had interacted more, European diseases, religions, weapons, goods, and livestock had sparked this significant change amongst Western Indian groups. So let's start with the 1500s and the introduction of the horse. So in the 1500s, most native groups had lived on the outskirts of the Great Plains. You can think of the Great Plains as that Louisiana territory that I had just shown you. So the Great Plains of the United States is this area right here. So most native groups were living on the outskirts, the western outskirts of the Great Plains over here. Now, the thing about this territory is that it is very inhospitable land. Inhospitable meaning that it's very difficult to live there. It's often referred to as the Great American Desert. You don't have a ton of food. I mean, it's difficult to grow food there. You have tornadoes. This is kind of tornado alley. I mean, it's very difficult to live in this territory. So you'd have native groups that lived on the outskirts of the Great Plains, had foraged for food, which means they went around and looking for food that was growing naturally and then picked that food to eat. They had fished, they grew crops, hunted buffalo on foot. But now with the introduction of the horse, many Indian cultures had changed completely. They had revolutionized their culture. So the horse had been extinct in North America for 13,000 years. Now, this doesn't mean that the horse had been extinct for 13,000 years. The horse still existed, and they were plentiful in Europe, but not in North America. So when the Spanish had ended up colonizing present-day Mexico and they created New Spain, they had brought with them their horses. So the horse was brought across the Atlantic Ocean into North America. And the Spanish introduced the natives to the horse, revolutionizing their lifestyle. The horse had served as a form of transportation. So it got natives from place to place in a much more efficient way. It served as a way to trade across large distances. No longer did you have to just trade with your nearest neighbor. Now you can trade with tribes or Europeans that were much further away than you. And then they were also used as a weapon in war. So as the horse was introduced, they can suddenly, natives can move much faster. They could raid different communities. They could retreat much faster. So moving on, Indians became horse breeders and trainers very quickly. So they were soon hunting buffalo over a vast territory. No longer were they hunting buffalo on foot. You had many Native American tribes that could suddenly become nomads, giving up their agrarian lifestyle. What a nomad is, it is somebody that doesn't have a permanent house or a permanent fixed house, but instead moves from place to place. So they could simply hop on their horses and follow the buffalo and attack the buffalo, use the buffalo for food, clothing, tools, weapons, bedding. It was a traditional custom to use all parts of the buffalo. If you had killed the buffalo, a way to pay respect to the buffalo is to use every part of the buffalo in some way. Additionally, clashes with other tribes and Europeans also resulted. So as native tribes had expanded their territory, they had interacted with peoples that they had not interacted with in the past. And clashes tended to be deadlier due to the introduction of guns. So trade networks also carried European diseases. So we just talked about horses. I briefly just mentioned guns there. And trade networks also carried European diseases. diseases such as smallpox, chickenpox, cholera, the measles, etc. So Indian groups had no prior exposure to European diseases and thus had no natural immunity. What natural immunity is, it is your body's natural defense against foreign diseases. So, for example, when I went to the University of Illinois, I was exposed to different germs that I had never been exposed to before growing up on the south side of Chicago. Suddenly, I was touching desks and door handles of people that came from all over the world. You had people that came from China, people that came from South America, students that came from California, from Texas. And so I was being exposed to many different types of germs. And what you often found was that many students at U of I would get sick, many freshmen would get sick within the first 2 months of being down at college, just because we freshmen did not tend to have natural immunity from germs, from diseases that they were not previously exposed to. So these different diseases, smallpox, chickenpox, cholera, measles, they had devastated native societies. And when I say devastated, I'm talking about that new epidemics kills anywhere from 15% to 90%, 9 out of every 10 people in the populations that they ended up infecting. So completely decimated entire societies. Powerful tribes were reduced to fractions of their original numbers. So you could have very, very large tribes that numbered in the tens of thousands that could be reduced to only several hundred people. Oftentimes when that happened, you would have smaller tribes that had been decimated by disease would then band together in order to provide for better defense against foreign tribes, or I should say enemy tribes, or European settlers. So how did Indians and Europeans interact? So I just mentioned horses, guns, diseases. Let's talk about their social interactions. So some Western natives had formed alliances with Europeans in order to gain power. So then this made sense because you had, especially small tribes, they knew that the Europeans, the Spanish, for example, the Spanish had horses, the Spanish had guns. And so if you can get access to those horses and guns, that puts you at a military advantage over enemy tribes. They gained access to guns, horses, but also different types of foods that they had never grown before. Other groups did not form alliances. Other groups had led raids against European settlements and forcibly stole livestock, guns, food, etc. So you had some interactions were positive, some interactions were negative, and then other interactions between natives and Europeans. Other tribes just tried to avoid Europeans altogether. Indians adapted, and they tended to adapt to changes that were brought about by Europeans, and European settlers tended to adapt to the New World. You had Indians were introduced to new foods. They acted as guides to Europeans. They acted as interpreters to Europeans. Think of Sacagawea. Some of you have probably heard of Sacagawea before. I'll show you a picture of her towards the end of this lecture. But Sacagawea had acted as a guide and an interpreter to Lewis and Clark on their expedition into the lands to the west of the Mississippi River. Many settlers had married Indian women. You have to imagine that if you are a British settler, a Spanish settler, for the most part, there were few British and Spanish women that were being brought across the Atlantic into this new world. And so, which it was not uncommon for European men to take on Native American women as their wives. Some Europeans even went so far as to join Indian tribes. And also this worked vice versa. You had some Native American women had joined these European settlements. How did some groups oppose the changes brought by Europeans? Well, let's talk about the Spanish. The Spanish had established missions. These missions were led by people that were known as missionaries. And these missions were aimed at educating Indians, and this is the most salient feature of a missionary, or of a mission, is converting these new people to Catholicism. So many groups had initially accepted some elements of Spanish society. However, the cost became too great for other tribes. So, for example, the Pueblos. The Spanish demanded labor and resources from the Pueblos, and even went so far as to outlaw their religion. 17,000 Pueblos had died from European disease in the 1600s, and finally it got to a point where the Pueblos just revolted. So Pueblos in 24 plus, so over 24 towns had revolted and ended up killing or frightening off the Spanish in what we today consider New Mexico. This took place in 1680. And you can see a picture of that here. You have the Pueblos hanging the Spanish missionaries here. Why did U.S. leaders believe the United States should expand westward? So now we're moving into a different topic altogether. We're moving away from Europeans and Western North America into U.S. westward expansion. So no longer are we talking about European interactions with the natives. Now we're going to start talking about American interactions with the natives. So let's start first with why American leaders believe that the United States should expand westward. Well, the United States was founded on these ideals of personal liberty and individual rights for certain people. And that's why I included this image. You can see an image of enslaved people. You can see an image of Native Americans, and these two images are superimposed over an image of the Declaration of Independence to kind of show the irony here. So as we already finished our last units, you clearly understand that this idea of personal liberty and individual rights was not extended to all people. We're really only talking about white property owners at the time. White male property owners, I should say. So the American treatment of Native people had contradicted the ideals that it set for itself. If we founded this nation on this idea of personal liberty, we did not allow the Native peoples to have their own personal freedom or their own individual rights. Rather, we restricted their rights, we took their land, and used violence in doing so. So since the arrival on this continent, British settlers had taken land from Indians by trade, trickery, and violence. The American Revolution was fought in part because the British had actually put limits on American expansion. Most Indian native groups had sided with the British against the colonists in the American Revolution because they wanted to stop the ambitions of Americans to expand the borders of their country westward. So many early leaders believed that land ownership was the key to preserving liberty and equality among the nation's white men. So with a growing population, more land had to be required. As the population got larger, you're going to run out of land if you're just going to give land to people. And so, with more people, you're going to need more land. So, U.S. leaders believe that they should expand the borders of the country past the Mississippi River in order to obtain that land. So, American leaders believe that their system of representative government, meaning that we were elect our leaders in this country, it's what's known as a republic, and this system of individual land ownership, American leaders believe this to be the highest form of civilization. And this form of civilization, this new American system, was superior to all other systems. So what you saw developing was this belief in an Anglo-American, meaning like a white British American racial superiority that was brought about. So that's the white American system of governance was superior to the Native American system of governance. So supporters of expansion argued that the United States was a chosen land, that the goal was to bring civilization to peoples of color across the continent. So when we're talking about civilization, as I mentioned, we're talking Christianity, representative governments, and land ownership. Many of these people were Christian Americans that believed that American expansion was actually ordained by God. And this was a concept that was known as manifest destiny. In other words, it was our destiny as a country to expand our borders from coast to coast because this was God's will. This was God's plan. And this is a famous painting that depicts this concept of manifest destiny. You have a woman that appears to be very heavenly. She looks like she's almost angelic in nature, and she's moving west. You can see the mountains, presumably the Rocky Mountains in the background, and then everybody here is moving west with this woman. And then over here, what you could see is these Native American people that are looking up at her and appear to be running away from these white settlers, from this idea of manifest destiny. So it's almost as if the Native Americans are retreating in the face of white America. So why was there disagreement within the United States about westward expansion? Well, proponents had argued, so proponents are people that are in favor of westward expansion. Proponents argued that expansion would unite the country and lead to economic growth. They said that there would be a wider agricultural base, meaning there's more land to farm if we're expanding the country westward, and there would be new natural resources that can be found. There would be more trees that can be chopped down for wood. There would be waterways that could provide fresh water to people. So you have all these different natural resources that can be used. Additionally, and I didn't put it on here, you had many Southerners that were proponents of slavery believed that expansion westward would be good for the expansion of the institution of slavery, that there would be more land to produce cotton, and with more cotton it leads to more money. Opponents argue, so opponents that were people against westward expansion, they argue that expansion was unconstitutional. So if something is unconstitutional, it means that it violates something that's inside the Constitution. So they argue that there was no provision, no clause in the Constitution regarding the incorporation of new territory into the Union. So it doesn't say that, well, the Constitution, which is kind of our rule book of this country, doesn't say that we even have the power as a country to incorporate new territory into the Union. And these opponents had also worried that unchecked expansion would divide the nation, stretch resources thin, and create a dispersed, ungovernable population, meaning that people would be spread out way too far uh, from each other, and it would lack this feeling of unity amongst the country, that people would not view themselves as Americans, rather they would associate themselves more with just their local community as opposed to the country as a whole. So the last couple concepts that we're going to talk about, one being the Louisiana Purchase. So the Louisiana Purchase is when this westward expansion really begins. So in 1802, France, eager to get out of their failing empire, failing North American empire, and also needing money for wars back home, had actually offered their Louisiana territory to the United States for $15 million. I believe that translated at the time to about 4 cents an acre, so a very, very cheap price. And the president at the time, Thomas Jefferson, had jumped at this opportunity to double the size of the country. So prior to the Louisiana Purchase, the country was only this territory right here that I'm circling, and then suddenly overnight with the Louisiana Purchase, the country doubles in size. And it extends not just from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River, but now extends all the way to the Rocky Mountains. It gave the United States, another reason why it's significant is that it gave the United States control over the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River, a major waterway in the United States, arguably the most major river in the United States, and it also leads to the Gulf of Mexico. So now you can have trade in the port of New Orleans, that the United States is going to gain control over this port, and they can therefore take any European goods all the way up the Mississippi River into what is then going to be considered the central part of the United States. The Louisiana Purchase had opened new lands for settlement, so now you could have settlers. They could occupy these different territories by traveling west and then purchasing a plot of land, farming that land. Now, to the thousands of Native Americans that already lived in this territory, these U.S. claims of ownership were meaningless. They didn't, that simply buying this territory from France did not mean anything to the Native Americans. This was their land. They perceived it as their land, not something that you can simply just be bought overnight with the signing of a treaty or an agreement. So in the 1900s, as a result, the United States would fight over 50 wars with Native American tribes in the Great Plains area in this Louisiana territory. And they would also negotiate with many Indian groups for sale of their land. And then the last topic we're going to talk about is the Lewis and Clark expedition. So why was the Lewis and Clark expedition significant? I had mentioned that the Lewis and Clark expedition, it was commissioned by Thomas Jefferson, and Lewis and Clark's job was to explore the Louisiana Territory, so anything west of the Mississippi, and try to find a waterway to the Pacific Ocean. Now, ultimately, that goal had failed. There was no waterway that was found that extended all the way to the Pacific Ocean. But Lewis and Clark did establish economic ties with Indian groups. They explored this land. They took very detailed notes. What's interesting is that they had encountered Indian people who were riding horses. They encountered Indian people who were wearing European-style clothes, that drank alcohol that was imported from Europe. and bore marks of smallpox, which is a European disease. So it was very clear to Lewis and Clark that they were not the first ones they were not the first settlers that had interactions with the native people. Rather, the natives had already been in contact with Europeans way before Lewis and Clark ever showed up. Most Indian groups, and this is my last point as I end this lecture for today, most Indian groups believed that U.S. citizens would be like Europeans, that they would be more interested in trade as opposed to permanent settlement. However, the difference between European interactions with the natives and American interactions with the natives is that Americans were interested in permanent settlements. That the Americans were looking to expand the borders of their nation and then furthermore settle the territory that they had just purchased from France. So the arrival of Americans in the West had marked a new era. All right, so with that, that's all I got for you today. I hope you learned something, and I'll see you next time.